Good
Hi,
morning,
Cobus, we're
everybody.
live.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. Colleagues and friends, welcome here from sunny South Africa. If there are anybody out there from other parts of the world, it's marvelous having you all here today. This is our inaugural webinar on our series of Tomorrow is Beautiful. So before we get going, just a brief welcome and the background to this initiative. So as an institution, we have committed ourselves to developing ethical leaders for the common good. And hence we endeavor to contribute meaningfully in these interesting and very challenging times that we find ourselves in. And this whole COVID-19 has turned our worlds upside down. Besides the way we work and travel and communicate nowadays, business models, among others, are being challenged to the very core. And within these challenging times, the question then becomes very relevant of how do we lead in these times, in this COVID-19 times and post-lockdown, as we're easing out into when the economy is unlocked step by step. But now, furthermore, how do we lead ethically in these times? There's this tension, we know, between the health of citizens and the economy on the other hand. So these polarities have to be managed. And at a national level, well, global level, but then even at the organizational level, and whether it is private or for-profit, non-profit, public organizations, it applies to everybody. And then, of course, I don't have to tell you the amounts of information that we get flooded with, and again, the issues of fake news, and we have to make our judgments. We have to make decisions on all these flows of information. So what do we do? And I also read very recently, as yesterday, in an article by Deloitte, perhaps very briefly, share that with you, that COVID-19 brought ethical issues around employment to the forefront that many may previously have viewed as ivory tower concerns, putting a spotlight on the impact of organizational decisions on worker lives every day. And these ethical implications extend to many segments of the workforce, but were particularly evident in the experience of the alternative workforce, some of whom face decreased demand and related financial concerns or increased demand and related safety concerns. So, friends, this beautiful day, the 20th of May, 2020, which is very apt for our inaugural webinar, we are going to, with the insights and the experience of our key presenter this morning, Dr. Jacques van Zyl, going to walk through some of these issues, and he will share with us his insights. Now, very briefly, Jacques is Director of Assessment World, a job profiling, performance appraisal, survey and competency assessment instrument developer and a provider. He's also an organizational behavior consultant that specializes in employee wellness, employee commitment, and consults on ethics and corporate governance, lean manufacturing, process optimization, human productivity. He does training, management consulting in various areas, such as material development, psychometric assessments, organizational diagnosis, and development. And Jacques is a developer and author of numerous psychometric instruments, and also a researcher for various formal projects. And in addition to that, friends, he's a lecturer, facilitator, and trainer in the managerial domain for various business schools in areas of ethics and corporate governance, finance, strategy, managerial economics, operations and project management, change management, leadership, and he has also supervised more than 80 MBA dissertation students. So Jacques, most welcome to you, and we really look forward to what you have to share with us this morning. And I'm, without any further ado, going to pass over to Jacques. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cobus. You were talking about 20 May 2020, and I was thinking about my age, which perhaps I'd hoped would be 2 times 20, but I'm on my way to 3 times 20. So yeah, quite prophetic what you're saying. Thank you for the intro. Everybody listening in, thank you for joining. I must say at this point in time, there are probably more questions than answers with regards to the theme that I'm dealing with this morning. So I'd rather want to invite you to listen a bit, make some notes. We're going to have some ample time to, I wouldn't say do question and answers, but to co-create a little bit around South Africa. And my focus will particularly be on South Africa, because I think at this point it's so easy to just get sucked into, the global picture and not really think about our own country. So what I'm going to do is about sort of 4 sections. I'm going to just take you a bit through, let's say, the tenets of leadership itself, how I see it, perhaps create a bit of a mental paradigm for you there. I'll then dive into the same kind of conversation around ethics, which for a lot of people is quite vague, yet there's a great body of knowledge and research around ethics, and then business ethics specific. And so I'll take you through that, create a bit of a mental paradigm. We'll then explore a little bit. And if I say we, please make notes and bring that to our co-creation at the end. Talk a little bit about the consequences during and post COVID, and what would be the issues that we will face. I've listed a couple, probably there are many more, and then we will attempt in the fourth kind of section. So how do we see ethical leadership specifically being employed to handle whatever it is that is coming our way? So without further ado, on that particular slide, that's the classic definition of leadership. The ability, I've just added, and executed competence to inspire others, followers, and co-leaders to achieve various objectives. That is in its broadest sense the definition of leadership. Let me just say right up front, the old argument, are you a good manager if you're a good leader, or a good leader if you're a management manager, is for me a stump conversation. I think leadership is packet and parcel of a postmodernist professional managerial leadership's competency bouquet. So I say competence, and by that I mean, amongst others, people skills, the ability to be inspirational and create productive relationships with employees and others. Yes, to be a visionary, to know exactly where we are going. Resilience comes to mind. These are tough times. In fact, I think the very nature of being a leader at a senior position in an organization requires quite a lot of resilience from us. That is, apart from having to deal with the kind of crises that we are facing currently. I also believe leadership is about having very strong and positive self-esteem, because we get challenged. It's not a popularity contest, and sometimes people agree, sometimes people disagree. Sometimes we have to make tough decisions which seem unethical at that point, which has a very adverse effect, for example, on our employees. But because we've got the facts and we are evidence-based, we have to make those decisions. But the effect on the self-esteem is quite large, which I want to link to wellness in terms of leadership. There's a book written called True North by Bill George, and it talks about authentic leadership. And it has a very specific focus on wellness of leaders, physical wellness, mental wellness, spiritual wellness, because it's not an 8 to 5 job. It's not a 5 out of 7 days job. It oftentimes, depending on the level of seniority, can take over our lives. Together with that is being tough-minded. I'm going to unfold for you a little bit of a difference between inspirational or transactional leadership, and it's kind of like co-nephew, which is the other one, which is more about inspiration and so on. So we'll have a look at that. But tough-mindedness, because leadership is not an easy job, for sure, for various facts that I've pointed out. So I would look in a leader for someone who's also very well structured and organized, And what I mean by that, in their own person, managing their own lives, managing their own development, and then also reflect for the organization a very strong, structured, and organized person and leadership practice. Leaders should also be, as far as I'm concerned, be very phlegmatic in these times. And what I mean by that is, I think the leader that just sticks to particular approaches and ignores the changes that are happening or the crises that are unfolding might have a problem. So they will have to accommodate various other points of view as well. So being phlegmatic is important. Others focused. Leadership is a people orientated competency set. So we work with people, and we lead people. We don't lead machines. So the people skill, the being focused on others, the welfare of our organization, the employees in our organization is very important. And then just finally, I'm a strong believer that 360-degree leadership is very important. Reason being, I think we need to deconstruct the leadership conversation a little bit, and also um, accept the fact that we might, even at the most junior level of the organization, have leaders who can influence others because of their levels of motivation and so on. So I very strongly believe that in an organization, we should develop everybody to become a leader. I think Robin Sharma refers to this concept as lead without title. Now, there we go. The one I was referring to is transformational. That slipped my mind there for a second. So if you go to leadership literature, just on Amazon.com alone, you will find over 70,000 books on leadership. So I had a little bit of a look at some studies that were done, and there was a great study done by a prof at UNISA, and she particularly looked at what is the language we use when we describe management and leadership and various approaches in leadership. And in my mind, it still distills into two main tracks of thinking when we think about influencing people. The one that's very popular is transformational, and I think a lot of South Africans see that as the pinnacle of leadership, which is that inspirational, motivational, visionary part where the leader is very visible, leads by example, gets employees or followers to perform beyond their own belief, charismatic, authentic, the new kind of kids on the block with transformational leadership that you can go and read up on is servant leadership, where great stuff from Ian Furr, the entrepreneur who, amongst others, created many other businesses like Sorbet and so on. He speaks about servant leadership, serving the people who then need to serve the customer. So he's very much focused on that. Neuro leadership, the SCARF model, being aware of your effect as a leader on the brain functioning of your followers. Do you create fear? Do you create reward? Do you create inclusivity? Go read up on that. Spiritual leadership is a new one I came across, which is really leading people to embrace the meaningfulness and the significance of the work that they do in an organization. Just lastly, on this particular area of transformational leadership, and there's a lot more written on it, but it's Ubuntu, which is the village idea, which is the community idea, which is I express my humanity through you and you through me, and we are interdependent. Desmond Tutu, in fact, says that Ubuntu might very well be the leadership sort of approach that Africa could give as a gift to the rest of the world. So that's the inclusivity part of it. Then on the other side, and I say other side, but I don't mean it like that, let's call it co-creating leadership, is the transactional leg, which is really based on the social contract and the leadership member exchange theory, which talks about you bring your labor and your effort to my department, to my company, and I will make sure that you are remunerated well, you are engaged well, you are looked after, you are motivated, and so on. So it's very much based on a social contract that speaks about I'll measure you, I'll reward you if you do well, and then I'll either punish you or I will remediate with you to get your performance to the level where it's acceptable in my contract. Another part of transactional is where leaders adjust to the style of their followers. So if you're more junior, I transact with you more on a telling level. If you are more senior, but you need a bit more guidance, I will gladly coach you. In my view, ladies and gents, I think it's a contingency situational model of leadership that I'm looking at, where I'm saying the skillful, competent leader, depending on the situation, will be able to navigate between either being transformational or transactional, depending on what the situation requires. My other view is just a quick view, which you might agree or not. I think leadership is a binary concept. I don't buy into the idea that there's something like a bad leader or an unethical leader. As far as I'm concerned, it's binary, it's dichotomous. You're either a leader or you're a non-leader. You might be on some developmental path towards achieving that leadership capability, but I think that is one of the misnomers we have in organizations. People get appointed in leadership positions by default or by virtue of what they studied, and not really in terms of leadership and leadership capabilities. Yes, the two have to go together. I can't have a technically incompetent person who's actually a great inspirator and visionary and so on. The two have to go together. Hence, I'm referring to a professional managerial leader. So you might disagree. I think it is a binary issue. So what is ethics and what is ethical leadership? Now, I'm just going to run you through a few, call them philosophies or paradigms for you to kind of like fit yourself into them. The definition really of ethics, it is to do that which is right or moral. And I'll unfold the concept of morality in a moment or two. It's used interchangeably in the literature. But it's really based on a Greek word that says ethos, which means custom or character or habit, the things that are right that create the habit. So that is what ethics is. I think the three gentlemen that come to mind from earlier philosophical times are the ones that I've got on the slide there. Let me pick Plato to start off with. Now, Plato was just very clear. He said, you know what? Humanity by design is immoral, and the only way that you are going to create ethos or good habit is by way of law. You got to make regulations, you got to make laws. That's the only thing that'll make people behave well. If you look at the current South Africa, we have a myriad of laws, very much based on the Platonian approach. Whether that always leads to compliance is a different issue, but that's Plato's idea. Socrates came along and he says, well, you know, he spoke about teleos. We all seek pleasure, and we can obtain that via seeking virtue or goodness, those things that are good, because that brings happiness. And how do we do that? He says it's very simple. You apply your intellect, you apply your reason. So that was the birth of moral intellectualism. In other words, the Socraterian method also says we sit down and we interrogate a particular decision. And then the only trump of the day, and no pun intended, but the only trump of the day would be then the moral argument, the one that is based on evidence. So later on, when I talk about RIM's rational interaction for moral sensitivity, it's very much Socraterian. Aristotle, the guy we base a lot of our thinking on in modern times, he says also we all seek happiness. It's the ultimate objective, our happiness and our well-being. He refers to that as eudaimonia. And he says we achieve that through virtues and behaving virtuously regarding virtues such as honesty, fairness, justice, liberty, gentleness. And he says that creates the good living. And an excellent character will do that right thing, and it'll create a great amount of pleasure for that particular person. Okay, we now know with Freudian psychology that a lot of people will suppress or rationalize their decision and say, but that does create pleasure. For example, if you look at a situation where a company severely retrenches in a turnaround strategy, for sure that'll create pleasure for shareholders, but it's definitely not going to create pleasure for the employees that have been laid off. So yes, a bit of a hole there in Aristotle's thinking, but we're going to talk about that when we talk about utilitarianism in a moment. Okay, so The other approach towards ethics is deontology, which is built on two Greek words. It's normative ethics, so it looks at deon, which is your duty, and logos, which is the logic. So you'll do your duty through logic. So it's very Socraterian based. Immanuel Kant is really the philosopher, that we credit with the development of deontology. And he said things are good or bad according to a clear set of rules based on rights and obligations, because we all have dignity, and ethical behavior is not just based on consequential logic, but he refers to a maxim, a drawing of the line in the sand. For example, do unto others as you want others to do unto you, and never treat people as a means to an end. He refers to that as the perfect duty, and he says there's no middle ground here. There's no negotiation. You simply do the right thing because logic tells you that that is your duty. He also then says that leads to a thing called the goodwill, and we don't have to surrender our moral beliefs in a situation or any situation, because the goodwill in itself, the goodwill towards people, environment, and so on, that constitutes the thing called ethics. Ladies and gents, utilitarianism, also part of normative ethics, guy by the name of John Stuart Mill, if you want to go and read up. And he simply just says, you know what, the greatest happiness principle states that a moral action is one that maximizes utility or happiness for the greater or the greatest number of people. Something which, in my view, is much closer to what ethical leaders should practice in South Africa, utilitarianism. Intuitionism, another one, goes very much with what Socrates was saying. It's about the intellect, applying the intellect. It builds nicely into what Dion Rousseau from the Institute of Ethics of South Africa talks about, the moral debate, when we sit together and we apply our minds to these various moral issues. Metaethics is one we have currently. We think about ethics in itself. It's called second order moral theorizing. But we're going to have a look at an outcome. For example, increasing VAT to fund, let's say, a political agenda would be a great example of where we apply meta ethics post the action, and then go and have a look normatively at why was this decision taken, what are the outcomes of these decisions, what can we do better. So it's not just simply applying some external set of laws or rules, but it's really reasoning about ethics itself. But that also brings into conversation then relativism and subjectivism. Relativism, ethical relativism, different societies, different businesses having different reasons for why they are doing things. Subjectivism, the individual person with their own subjective inner mental world. Like, for example, I cannot understand why they don't put a person in jail because they stole a bread from Pick and Pay. Because they're lazy, they're not working. By the way, I earn 140K a month, so I go and buy the bread, I don't steal it. That's kind of like a subjectivistic way of looking at the behavior of another. But that comes into meta ethics when we start thinking about it. Ladies and gents, there's a lot more to say about ethics, but I very quickly just want to draw your attention to kind of like four political, philosophical, ethical schools of thought. And the reason why I think that is important, if you look at current era South Africa, with the involvement of government in many decisions, the questioning of those decisions, the relationship between government and organized business and so on, there are various questions that we need to ask. And it's very good to be aware that a lot of thinkers have looked at that. A guy by the name of John Rawls, who really looked at the issue of the welfare state and said, no, you can't have that. You should have a property owning democracy where the state assures that the average individual has a chance to actively participate in the market economy and not just hand out. And that brings into very sharp focus questions in South Africa around the ethical nature of grants and their longevity. I'm not expressing an opinion, but that's typically in Rawlsian thinking that you'd have a look at. There's libertarianism, which Robert Notska is very much credited with, which says the focus in ethics and in the relationship between the individual and state and business should be based on individual rights and freedoms, and that you should have actually a minimal state involved in this. Communitarianism, which is very much the Ubuntu way of thinking, that we are connected to each other and every action has a reaction within the community of employees or voters or consumers or whatever the case might be. Robert Notzke wanted utopianism, no state. Can we actually achieve that? Very difficult. So he goes for the minimal state. And that approach very much links to new liberalism, which sees competition as the defining characteristic of all human relations. We are consumers, we buy, we sell, there's the market, it delivers benefits, and any attempt to limit competition by the state, for example, are treated as contra to libertarianism. So trade unions, for example, would be seen by libertarianists or utopianists as market distortions that impede the formation of a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. Important that we take note that there is a section of society that thinks like that. Okay, I want to end this off with lifeboat ethics. Very shortly, it's called survival morality, and I think it very much links with what we are currently seeing and what we will see more unfolding in South Africa as COVID takes its toll, which is, I don't have work, my family is hungry, I am desperate, what do I do? Do I kill my fellow, and this is metaphorically speaking, my fellow lifeboat occupant who's already busy dying, and so eat him or her? Lifeboat ethics, survival morality. So do I go steal? Do I go plunder? Or do I not do those things, but I'm still hungry? I think we are going to be faced with some serious ethical dilemmas going forward. And I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom here, but you can already see this happening in South Africa, the building up of pressure, the building up of desperation, which might lead to lifeboat ethics. It also applies to corporates. How many corporates are going to come out of this thing and are going to say, sorry, we need to reduce the staff component by 30% and reduce salaries by 20%. We have to survive. It begs some serious questions about the remuneration distribution in the organization, the idea that can we still have shareholder primacy in a situation like this where shareholders demand the maximization of their wealth and so on. Huge questions that we need to ask. I believe, all in all, this model is very, very applicable in South Africa. I think we're going to be forced back into our real beliefs about humanness and humanity and the way we do business and capitalism and the rule of or the role of the state with regards to its citizens. I think we're going to be challenged very deeply beyond a value level, but onto a belief level. So finally, in this segment, ladies and gents, can we talk about ethics and ethical leadership being binary, given just the complexities that we are dealing with here? I think my personal belief at this point is yes, it hinges towards binary. However, because of chaos, social chaos that's being created by this virus and in the economy in South Africa, I do believe we have to sit back from this binary idea and say, we have to include many ideas here. There are many different needs. So who is then the number one ethical leader? The one who says tax more to allow government to create more fiscal stimulus, or is it the other way around that says, now allow business to come out of this in a year and a half, create jobs, stimulate the economy? Where do you sit ethically and where does society sit? So I think it's not that binary at this particular moment. I think in an ideal world where there's perfect distribution, of resources in an economy and in a society, then I think we could talk about a binary ethical leadership approach. So Aristotle, the guy who I really think is very applicable in our day and time, spoke about the ethical dilemma that leaders are faced with. Now, what is an ethical dilemma? It's also known as a moral dilemma, which, by the way, is about what is right and wrong. And these are situations in which there's a choice to be made between two options, neither of which resolve the situation in an ethically acceptable fashion. It's the theory of constraints here. Where does government spend the money that they borrowed from IMF and from the BRICS Development Bank? Where is it best spent? Should it be spent only on stimulating growth in the economy? What percentage should be? What percentage should go to the handing out of food parcels, which, again, from a lifeboat ethic perspective, is seriously important. So, what is the common good here? And again, I don't think one actor in the economy, one actor in politics, or one grouping can make that decision. There has to be robust, rational interaction for moral sensitivity. There has to be transparent, open debate about what would be the common good for South Africa right now. It's a dilemma in itself. Then if you look at the other, so if you're a corporate, your other would definitely be other stakeholders. Yourself would be you, the executives, the board, the shareholders, the employees who work for that organization, and then kind of like more towards others would be your consumer on that continuum. So again, in this time, you are faced with an ethical dilemma. How do you decide what is the best way forward? Now, again, Aristotle spoke about what he referred to as a golden mean. There's no absolutistic point on this triangle. And it's not perfectly in the middle. That's not what the golden mean says. But based on data, based on the rational argument, based on inclusivity, transparency, sharing of that data, taking criticism, taking feedback, and then making the decisions should get you closer to the golden mean. It's not a perfect science. We know that. There's always, when ethical decisions are made in this field of constraints, there are winners and there are losers. I think the approach should be to minimize the losses and maximize, and that's where, for me, the idea that we should seek for the greatest good for the greatest number, but definitely we cannot provide that for the full number. Simply, if you look at our population numbers, that is just not going to be, we're not going to be able to do that. But that is the ethical dilemma. What do we pick? So I think if I take that idea further, the actors or the agents at this point involved is definitely society. Society, to a large degree, is on the receiving end of all of this. And one of the suggestions I'm going to make towards the end here is that we need to develop societal leaders. I think that's one of the lessons we are learning, is that society also needs to be represented by their organic leaders. There's the state, and I deliberately put their state and not government, because in a democracy, a state should be sovereign. A state's, and the state with its departments, with its various arms and institutions, should serve society, from which, by the way, the factors of production come from, that goes to corporate and business, which I'll explain in a second. But the state should be sovereign. Now, the moment I populate state with officials, it is a government. One of the suggestions I'm going to make is you don't govern, you serve. You serve through state. Because if that is the plan, if that is the mindset, the mental model that we use, that we say state belongs to society, it belongs to the people, it is just a privilege to serve society through state. If that is the approach, we might do away with excessive power abuses, corruption, etc. Then there's corporate. Now we know about King 4, King bases in the beginning. In his first principle, he talks about ethical leadership and the principles around that. So from an ideal point of view, he clearly says, when you make ethical decisions, use these as your mental models. And then, of course, he unfolds the rest of his code. But corporates, definitely going forward, the leadership in corporates in terms of creating economic growth, perhaps redistributing remuneration in the organization at this point in a more fairly and equitable manner, just to retain people and to allow them to look after families, is going to be a very important decision. Business, we know that there's an invisible GDP out there. There's an informal sector. There's a shadow economy. A lot of people are dependent on that. They've been shut down. They are not actually represented. And in a post-COVID South Africa, I do believe that they have to be given a voice and not just purely regulated for the tax net purposes. And I know a lot of you are going to differ, going to say, no, bring them in the tax net. I say if you do that, you kill them off. But there's a huge ethical question that state and corporate have to ask about that area. The outcome fundamentally has to be ethical and value-adding output to society and environment and so on. So very important that those actors do work together. So ladies and gents, I've just listed a couple of things that I think, is going to be post-COVID chaos that we are going to sit with. We know, it's well documented. Many economists, etc., talk about the reduced GDP, the constricting of the economy by 16% and so forth. So there are many numbers doing the round out there. We know we're going to take a serious knock in terms of GDP, which of course has many other knock-on effects as well. But that's a big one. Higher, and I specifically said higher unemployment because before COVID, we already had high unemployment. This thing is going to grow very badly. I saw the other day projections of around about another 2 million out of the current 9.8 million, plus or minus a bit, that will be out of jobs. Now, remember, there we talk about the formal economy, the formal GDP contributors. What about that informal economy where one small entrepreneur fixing cars in the back of his yard or her yard look after 6 people? So that unemployment we don't even count for. Okay, so that's going to be even higher. We're going to be faced with that. That obviously will increase the levels of poverty and whatever goes with poverty, as we know, increased susception to illness, social unrest, desperation, suicides, and so forth. The level of bankruptcies will definitely increase. We know that, especially with SMEs, MMEs, the smaller companies running about a 1.52 million turnover and so on. And these things are often very invisible to the economy because our focus is so much on corporate and organized business. But that's going to increase and it's going to have devastating effects on families down the value chain. Personal hardships, don't even want to talk about that. We hear these stories, we see these videos, it's going to increase. When I refer to social fragility, I'm very careful when I pick this particular one because we can already see on the peripherals of the classes how social fragility is setting in. We don't know where it's going to. We don't know where the levels of desperation, the level of hunger, the levels of exclusivity is going to take various classes in society towards. And may I include there those consumers, those people who are employed, but who carry a very high debt burden. Last time I looked, it was 79 cents in every gross rand earned for households in South Africa. What's going to happen there? How are the banking leadership going to get involved in addressing that situation? So when I say social fragility, it's not just focusing on the poorest of the poor. It's also focusing on those who are entrepreneurial, those who are working, have the privilege of working, but had to borrow very deeply and heavily, in any case, to sustain life for themselves. Very fragile. Ladies and gents, psychologically, we know that. I've just mentioned 2 things here. Fear and distrust. That's just 2 that I picked. We can already see that developing, and you don't know where that pushes levels or strata of society in terms of the fear and distrust of the system, of corporates, of government, the state, and so on. I see a rise in protectivism, unfortunately. You can already hear the talk amongst, call them then the haves, the families that are at least okay. Saying things like where they will shop in future, increase security at their homes, because they don't know what's going to happen. Protectivism of my job, depending on which position I'm in at the organization. So I see a lot of protectivism developing. and a lot of, and we talk about social distancing, I see a lot of psychological distancing happening because people are going to go right back to lifeboat ethics and protect that which they have. Finally, I see on my little list a great amount of polarity between the three major actors here, which is the state, corporate, and society. It is limited resources that we are dealing with here. So who's going to get what and give it to whom, or who is going to earn what and then do what with that resource? So I'm not sure. I can't look into the crystal ball, but I think we're going to see some very interesting, I hope, debates that's going to happen to sort out, as what I see it, an increased polarity and competition for resources in South Africa. Finally, ladies and gents, and again, I'm going to ask you to co-create. Give me 4 more minutes to just give you my bit on it. I think ethical leadership during COVID and post-COVID has to employ what is called a proactive morality. As you read strategically what you think is going to come 2 years down the line with your organization, read what might be the next 2 years as the new normal in South Africa. Have moral debate around that, because your decision that you take now will influence that curve. And so think a bit into the future, and think about consequences. We do that all the time strategically. I think we should do that for ethics and morality and the decisions we take now in our organizations, in state, and so on. I think socialized power motive is at the order of the day. I really think, and if I could just talk about corporates, don't just reduce the employee number. You've got the power to remunerate. You've got the power to appoint. You also have the power to redistribute remuneration on the medium term in the organization, to retain employees, and to write this out and to grow from this. But unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, it's the typical South African route. When it comes to turnaround, it's restructure and retrench. You can't fault that, because ethically, morally, from a capitalistic point of view, and yes, I know that that is subjective and it is perhaps not the absolute greater good, but that currently is the mode we live by in business. So I really do think that socialized power motive, very important. Don't just restructure, retrench, think a bit broader. Organizational justice goes with that. I'm even going to spend time on that. When I talk about and then distribution of resources, I'm not just referring to a minimal state, or at this point, a bit more of a maximal state assisting with that. I'm also looking at organizations. I'm looking at businesses. The Global Reporting Index is very clear when it talks about your internal stakeholder as a business, which is your employee, which is very important, which is something I think we should protect very deeply as leaders. I refer to a thing called corrective capitalism, and I'm definitely not a socialist. But what I'm saying is that we can see that capitalism, even during this time, is failing to create transmission mechanisms to be an ethical player in terms of society as well. And I'm not just talking about the limited corporate social responsibility budgets of companies. I'm really talking about fundamental shifts in the structure of the way we see capitalism, in the way that we practice capitalism, so that we have a greater good component for the greater number of people. Servant state goes without saying. Let go of your positional power. You are a servant. I'd like to see a represented society with leaders that represent them. And I'm not talking about the political leaders. I'm talking about societal leaders. There has to be a lot of moral debate. Again, Dion Rousseau refers to RIMS, rational interaction for moral sensitivity, where each voice or each person has a voice. There are no class levels. I contribute towards the moral debate, even if I'm the poorest of the poor. Listen to my voice. Let the emotion go, is what he says. And in the end, he says, it is the argument, the moral argument, by proof, by evidence, that is the referred to form, situated in unities. We need to question what the bigger, more powerful actors in business and government are doing. We need that. On a personal level, my second last point, ladies and gents, I think on a personal level, leaders are going to need a lot of resilience, EQ, SQ, which is the spiritual intelligence, transparency, vision. I think a lot of leaders in South Africa have to sit and reflect on, who am I as an ethical leader? What do I need to change? What have my practices been up to this particular point? Where do I need to develop to become a very good ethical leader during this time? I think finally, from a transactional leadership point of view, we're going to need some serious managerial leadership. I asked that question, what is the plan? And the plan cannot just be government or a small number of government senior officials who make plans. It has to involve everybody, from the weakest of the weak in society to the most powerful in business. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I end my conversation. And I think we are open to, it says Q&A, but I would rather think it should be co-creation. So thank you very much, and let us have your questions.
So perhaps while you are thinking of questions to pose, Jacques, thank you very much for that insightful presentation, and your views and thoughts, really very valuable. Now, while you were talking, and moving towards the end, I was reflecting again on what a colleague once said about the longest distance in the universe. Immediately one thinks about, are we talking about interstellar type of distances? But he said that the longest distance in the universe is the distance between the head and the heart. So when it comes to this, the ethical behavior, we've got a lot of knowledge and about what it is. But I'm wondering, often bridging that distance between the head and the heart, and making really also a matter of the heart, so that the behavior really, this ethical conduct manifests in real, call it tangible, or what one can see, in one's actions, don't judging people by their actions. And for example, if like at Mill Park, we look at this development of ethical leaders for the common good through the lens, among others, of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's currently happening, what I've read recently as well, just the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, that of eradicating poverty, has been so illuminated anew. In fact, it's as if it's gotten a push, where there were certain improvements in that space, where we're really moving again into a direction of, and I mean the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and others have reported on this, facing severe poverty going forward. And furthermore, when you spoke about the great philosophers, especially looking at Aristotle, what comes to mind is also our own kind of orientation of the Aristotelian virtue of phronesis, that of practical wisdom, that moral ethical value that's contextual, it's or context dependent rather, and typically, if we consider the context that we're in, it's pragmatic in its approach, and with the ultimate aim for the decisions that one make, that those decisions then be for the common good. But I think you also referred earlier on to determining for ourselves what is this common good for us now within this situation and then post this situation. And then, further to that is that ability to connecting the dots and not just fixating on one particular element of the ecosystem, but endeavoring to draw all those various variables into one's frame of mind during this dialogue. And I very much like your reference to really, the dialogue around the ethical concerns, and towards the end as well, addressing, among others, what you refer to as that social fragility. And I mean, it's what I find phenomenal is how the impact that it has had is in such a short space of time. It was something that's now happening over months and years. It was sudden, but the recovery is the thing, ironically, that will now take months and years, so to speak. So thank you so much. That's just a few of my own thoughts in what you've shared, but that it requires perhaps, and from the group of that attended today, being inspired to start really tangibly contribute to this dialogue that you referred to earlier on.
Definitely co-create. I just want to check, Cobus, have you got line of sight there of some questions on the chat area?
Jacques, not per se. There's one among others. I think traditional leadership models is going to be challenged. And I'm concerned that the broader management society just simply are not equipped to adapt to their style.
I agree. There's going to have to be a lot of development. Thank you for that. I agree.
Yeah, indeed. And I absolutely concur that the management and leadership orthodoxies will be challenged to its very core.
I think there was a question in the background that I heard there. I'm not sure whether I heard correctly.
Hi, Jacques. Hi, everyone. I see that there is a question. How can non-leaders in binary terms, however, in leadership roles, start acting ethically?
Good question. For me, it becomes, it starts in the 360-degree model with self-directed leadership. So even though I might not hold the position, what I do, even if I'm at the most junior, non-managerial position in the organization, people look at my behavior. And if my behavior is according to ethical guidelines, hopefully through some kind of learning, others see that and they start repeating that, or they talk to me about that. So I do believe that I don't have to be in a position of ethics to be an ethical leader. Team leaders, for example, in the mining environment, one person managing 4 people going down a cage can be very ethical in the way that they listen to the concerns, they attempt to assist, they inspire, and so forth. So I agree with Robin Sharma. It's lead without title on any level in the organization.
I noticed there's also a question on what is your opinion on bullying people in these times of crisis?
I mean, by all schools' application of ethics, I mean, that is unethical. Any coercion at this point by any one of the formal actors in our environment is absolutely unacceptable, because you don't take account also just for one of the human dignity of another. And that is unacceptable. So short answer, absolutely no go.
Oh,
Are we seeing some more questions there?
Yeah, Jacques, there's another one. What is your opinion on the restriction of movement now in lockdown?
Yeah, look, if I fall back on my evidence-based sort of approach towards what would constitute ethics and morality, I think if that were to be based on scientific fact, and if that were communicated transparently to, let's say, society and business, so that we could be part of that debate, and if the outcome then for the greater good would be restrictions, I'm saying that's fine. If, however, it is shrouded in secrecy, only a few have access to this, and it's not communicated to society and to business, I have a huge ethical question around that, because it all comes back to giving the rational basis for why that particular decision was taken. And if rationality says, and if the fact says, yes, that's the way to go, then that's the way we go. If not, or if it's being kept away or not being made transparent, I have a huge ethical question around it.
Thank you, Jacques. Another one came up there. How do you deal with people in COVID-19 not meeting their KPIs or doing a particular task or completing a project?
Look, again, and I mean, circumstances differ, but just thinking from, let's say, the fairness principle, in that managerial expectation that this is what I want you to do, did I also transactionally come to the table and enable you to do that? Did I also execute my managerial tasks of monitoring, controlling, and so on? So I would ask that question of the manager leader. But then, of course, you might get people who use this particular fluidity in the situation to not take up those responsibilities. And as far as I'm concerned, again, based on proper fact finding, if as the manager leader, I'm of the opinion that you were well resourced, the timelines were acceptable, the expectations were in line with what we normally do, you did not perform, that's where I step in with the social contract, and there's got to be some kind of consequence, you know, whether that is a stern talk to or whatever it is that the company has on a path of escalation. I think leadership, part of leadership or ethical leadership, is to confront people who are not ethically minded in their behavior during this time. I think there is perhaps increased levels of empathy at this point, but I think leaders have to be very careful, you know, that is also not abused from employees' side.
There's quite a number of questions coming up at the moment, and perhaps there's just one there from Eric. If one person is putting an other person or other lives at risk, perhaps bullying is acceptable? Question mark. Now, you know, I don't know what the extent of putting others' lives at risk. If it's implying by people who's not adhering to the protocols of wearing masks and everything else, or if it implies anything else, such as being robbed or something to that effect. But I suggest that, and Jacques, please comment on this as well, but I suggest that bullying per se remains unethical. It is the way.
Yeah, it's not the way to go. Yeah,
it's the way in which I go about dealing with a particular problem or situation or challenge in a way that is morally acceptable, and it is ethical, it is respectful, and it is ultimately again with the intent of the common good.
Absolutely. Go pull an article by Prof. Jackson from the Harvard Law School, where he talks about the moral cultural model of ethical decision making and behavior, and one of the legs his model stands on is human dignity, and I think that is fundamental. So one bad cannot, or one lesser bad cannot correct a worse bad. It's as simple as that. And you're right, Kobus. I can enforce, of course I can enforce, because it's for the greater good, but it's how I do it, how I keep human dignity intact. That's the important thing.
Yeah. See, there's one here, as a leader watching other leaders in this time of crisis, when our moral compass is being challenged around layoffs, paying landlords, etc., what advice would you give us?
You know what? I don't know the complexities of the business of the person who asked that question, but if you were to put me in a position right now, I would focus on my internal stakeholder, my employees, as the most important asset. I find it so ironic. We talk about human capital in our organizations, and people are assets. Yet when we hit a crisis wall, that's the first thing we target, to survive. So I would simply, and I mean, King is very clear on this even before this. He said, find alternative ways for dispute resolution. I would go and recontract with my own creditors, but I would be very focused ethically on protecting my employees and protecting their jobs as far as I possibly could.
Thanks, Jacques. I think, colleagues, I'm going to just one more question because we are running out of time. The one here that states, with people being asked to return to the workplace with a lack of medical solution, do we assume this means that we are working on an acceptable human loss model per capita for the sake of business continuity?
Yeah, I just got sent an article from research that's been done. I haven't read it, but the numbers do say, if lockdown ends, we'll have 1 million infections and 40,000 deaths and so on. This is an extreme situation, I believe, where it unfortunately has become a choice between lives lost and cost per capita for the economy to remain closed. I think in terms of the lifeboat ethic at this point, if I had to apply that and I had a lot of people inputting into my thinking, I will most probably try and get to a golden mean or a balance where I would hinge towards reopening the economy, having all these social distancing measures in place, allow this virus, and I'm not a virologist or a medical practitioner or specialist, but allow it to take its course, mourn the death. I know it sounds callous, but mourn the death. But in the end, for the greater number of people in South Africa, the loss will be far less when you reopen the economy. That is a personal point of view, ladies and gents. It's not, I haven't checked this with Milpark or anybody. It's a personal point of view. And I think a lot of debate will still have to be launched as far as this is concerned. But thank you very much. Kobus, I just like to say tomorrow is beautiful. It's perhaps going to take us a day or two longer to get there, but South Africans are resilient. We are a tough bunch, and we will get there. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, absolutely, colleagues. We've had time. It's phenomenal, and we could go on for the rest of the day as we thrash out these issues. Now, as we stage the restrictions, ask ourselves some critical questions to help prepare us for the perceived and the actual ethical implications and impacts of our business decisions. We should also be very closely monitoring the response, government's response, as this will too continue to evolve coming out of this crisis. So today was kind of an introduction or a teaser, as they say. There are so many questions, and as I said, we could have spent the whole day, but we really, really appreciate your presence here, your participation, the questions and so forth. And next week, we will be having our seminar, our webinar on 3 potential scenarios for South Africa post the COVID-19, or rather post the lockdown, because the virus is going to be with us for some time to come. So check out the social media channels for predictions, and we're really looking forward to engaging with you again. And from my side, signing off now. Thank you. It was wonderful engaging with you. And Jacques, once again to you, awesome. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.